now. And I'm sharing the screen, which is this one. Let's see if you click the actual share button. And there we go. All right. So not spending too much time on review, but review's important. We connected in what was going on with the two great awakenings and the American Revolution. And last week we talked a little bit about the growth of the United States heading west. Initially that meant just get over those Appalachians. Eventually that means get over that big plain and those Rockies to get to where you need to get. And that what went with those settlers was their beliefs. And that primarily that phase of growth in American Christianity is Protestant in nature because it's mostly Methodists and Baptists that are the largest percentage of the growth. Not to say it's exclusive to that. And so we talked about the Methodist movement, John Wesley, and how that tied to the First Great Awakening. And today we're going to sort of go through an overview of the evolution of Baptist denomination moving forward. This will be a high level hit, and partly because I think we know a lot of this history to some degree, but tying it all together and understanding where we as Southern Baptists fit in that picture as part of the equation as well. So if you remember our chart from before, we've gone down most of these branches now. We've been here. We've been in the Anglican Church. We've certainly talked about the Catholic Church. By the way, next week we're going to circle back around and pick back up with what's been going on with Catholics since 1517. But we've gone down the path of talking about obviously Calvinism and Congregationalists and the early parts of Baptists in England, and then how that transplants to the United States. Today we're going to focus primarily on the U.S. experience for Baptists. And then we'll circle back around again next week and pick back up with Catholics. And then we'll pick up this little grouping over here, Pentecostals and Charismatics, because that's later, early 20th century, but then obviously moving down through the 20th century to where we are today. We're going to talk about the three waves of the Pentecostal movement, which are identifiable there. We've done that. We pretty much will have covered everything. So we'll come back and tidy it up. But again, then we'll also come back and pick up what in the world happened to this branch, because we left it so long ago, the Orthodox Church. The Eastern Orthodox Church is still alive and kicking over there in various forms. And so we'll talk about how it responded to the Reformation and didn't respond to the Reformation, because in some ways it didn't have to, because it wasn't as geographically associated with it, but had other issues that were going on as well, particularly pressures even after this period of time, moving forward before this, but after this, particularly pressures from what eventually becomes, once the Constantinople falls, once the Ottoman Empire rises, the growth of Islam in that part of the world and its influence as well. So any questions about the broad, big scope thing? Been a while since we've actually seen this or looked at this, but some of this should be much more familiar now. You know what a lot of these dates are and how these things get to where they are. Okay, so I'm going to ask the question. When I say Baptist, what pops into your head?
Congregational, very anti-institutional or anti-patriarchal, or not
John Baptist.
Yeah. Hello?
John the Baptist.
John the Baptist, okay.
Okay.
And actually, we will pick up on an element of that in something that we'll talk about today when we talk about landmarkism. But
Dunking.
huh?
Dunking.
Dunking.
Immersion.
We believe in immersion, right? So we talked about baptism at a number of points. We've gone through this. What does it represent? What is it for? We Baptists, we dunk. And baptism being an important part of this thing. What else?
Well, for me, I think most representative of the New Testament church.
Okay.
In a lot of ways.
And we'll talk also a little bit about that. We'll talk about landmarkism. We've touched on this before, but because that is the question here, right? Which denomination is getting doctrine right? And I think it is a fair statement to say that every denomination that is truly represented being Christian is getting some things right, and probably almost all of them equally said are getting some things probably wrong, or not emphasizing, de-emphasizing or emphasizing things either way in that right and wrong. Putting too much emphasis on maybe something or not enough emphasis on something. And that's why I think going through the study has been helpful for me, and hopefully it's been for you, is trying to understand how to balance all those things out. Maybe what are we missing that we could incorporate more in? What are we, also the reinforcement of, we look at scripture, we got that right. So that's good. I think that's a challenge there. You guys have not hit upon what we're going to talk about today. One of the most important things I think that is a Baptist contribution to Christian work. Not exclusive to Baptists, but it's a big part. And Mickey knows this more than anybody in the room. What are Baptists known for globally? Missions. Particularly international missions, what we used to call foreign missions. Now we call international missions, which is an interesting, just that choice of term becomes an interesting. We used to talk about home missions and foreign missions.
Yeah.
And now we talk about international missions. And we're going to talk about as we go through here, sort of how that came to be. And I think it's a very important part of our Baptist heritage and our Baptist present in terms of what they're, again, not exclusive. Baptists are not the only ones doing mission work globally by any stretch of the imagination. But if you want to look at some of the most organized and effective global mission work that's happened, there's a lot to point to there and see in the process.
Don, when did we start this study?
Probably too long ago for us still to be going on with it, but we started when we finished up the 90 days in the Bible thing, which we started at the first of the year in 2020. Yeah, so we probably started in April-ish, May-ish of last year. Spring of last year, late spring. It was before I started doing the recordings and posted them. I think the recordings go back now almost a year, I think. I think I started that about because we were doing it remotely and we could do it.
Yeah.
I think I started that last fall. I noticed, I was looking at that the other day because I changed the main screen, the title screen, I changed it a little bit for last week. And so I was going back to look to see. I thought about going back and changing all the title screens. I said, no, that's being annotated. We don't need to do that. But it goes back a pretty good ways.
Yeah.
All right, so let's move forward talking about Baptists. So we're just going to hit on this. We touched on this indirectly. There are a couple of different ways you can divide Baptists into subgroups. One of the things are regular Baptists and separate Baptists. Separate Baptists, I'm only going to mention this because I'm going to see this move through a little. You're going to see it referenced in these slides. By the way, these slides are clipped out of Mikey Newborn from he's not Southern Seminary there in Tennessee. This is clipped from his stuff. So he mentioned some of these things I wanted to at least include it in. The best way I think you can think of, if you see the term regular and separate Baptists are a little bit more on what seems to lean towards being charismatic in that sense. And they also are a little bit less formal in terms of how they're organized church-wise. We'll see this as we go through. Regular Baptists are more the reason that Baptist seminaries exist in the sense of having formalized education. Separate Baptists tend to believe, or a little bit more like some elements we'll see, particularly when we get into Pentecostalism, that it's there's no need, you don't need a degree to preach the gospel, which is true, but you don't necessarily need, you don't need educated theologians. You just need people that are called out. And so the separate Baptists are a little bit more along the lines of again, what we may think of today in our modern use of the term as being charismatic, and also not having clergy in the sense of paid clergy, staff, basically lay led is the other part of what's here. We're going to see this is
That's the separate
the
Baptist.
separate Baptists. We're going to see this is a theme through the 19th century as there's sort of the two groups of Baptists and how Baptists form. The other thing I wanted to mention particularly that relates to this is this flows out of the Great Awakening in the sense of the types of things we talked about with open air preaching, with more of an evangelistic, not the same word that doesn't mean necessarily the same thing. They're both about good news, but a different way. Is part of what's going on here. So I don't want to dwell on this, but he's going to use these terms in some of the slides. I decided to keep this in just so it wouldn't be totally lost. And one of the interesting things is that Baptists tend to form associations. We do not have, for the most part, as Doug pointed out, it's not a hierarchical arrangement. Does that mean that Baptists don't work together? The answer is no. They do so though in an associative fashion. So one of the themes of Baptist associations going all the way back, we're going to see that as we start going through the history here, is they were primarily provided as a place for doctrinal training, which makes perfect sense, and other practical training for pastors. I mean, a lot of times when we think about pastors, I know Aaron can speak to this, those that have gone through seminary, yes, they get a lot of Bible, how to do exegesis, they preaching classes, but they also get administration classes. They get practical leadership classes that go there as well. And so associations were designed for that, to have a place where you could pool resources to do this a little bit better. Also for churches seeking pastors as well as pastors seeking churches. How do you, when you need leadership at a new church, or how do you plan a new church? Well, it's helpful if you have a place that's helping find the pastor for the church or helping the church find the pastor, as the case might be. So associations in the Baptist denomination have long handled that. Provided benevolent work for churches, a fellowship place for pastors, and of course, training young pastors in preaching. You see the theme through here primarily is around training and support. And that's true of associations for Baptists pretty much all the way through history, going back, particularly though the early part of the 19th century. Baptists were also a big part of religious liberty. We talked about this, the Great Awakening, the Baptist elements that were in there. A lot of that was Methodism, but Baptists were there as well. And so there were two great things that really were influential in the first part of the 19th century. Spiritually, the Second Great Awakening. And then what's going on outside of that is the Enlightenment. I talked a lot about this actually last week. Beginning in the late 18th century, so the late 1700s on through about the 1830s, a little bit later if you want to especially talk about what's going on in Latin and Central America, that 50 to 60 year span is the age of revolution. American Revolution, French Revolution, the various revolutions that lead to the independent nations in South America that are breaking away, Simon Bolivar and those types of things. It's an age of revolution. A lot of that is being driven by the Enlightenment and the idea of freedom, revisiting what freedom means and what do you do with it, and the concept of democracy being part of that. The idea that it's the government is not by divine right to an individual, the divine right of monarchs, but that the citizens have a role in choosing their government. That's obviously what our nation is founded upon, this idea that the rights of the government are derived from whom? From the governed. We give those rights over. So this is the great thing that's going on. And so Baptist growth is happening with that as the backdrop. So obviously, I think we talked about this a couple of weeks ago. There's this influence that goes back and forth. The church is influencing society and the society is influencing church. That's happened throughout history, but it's particularly happening during this particular frame of time. Someone has referred to the 19th century as the great century for Baptists. And so we'll talk a little bit about why that is. One of the most well-known figures in terms of by name is Charles Spurgeon. Everybody heard of Charles Spurgeon? He was probably the most famous preacher globally of his day, and he was a Baptist. He was in England, although he did preach in the United States. This was during the Victorian era, and he was, again, you see the term of Prince of Preachers. he happened to be a particular Baptist. So mentioning that idea of particular versus separate versus regular, he happened to be along the lines of being much more Arminian in his approach than other Baptists were. And just note here, preached the largest crowd ever without amplification, almost 24,000 people just within the hearing of his voice. I guess is when he was done with that, his voice must have been pretty tired. Yeah. So this is a picture of him as a younger man, moving towards middle age. See a different picture of him here. So he's one of the most well-known figures for Baptists, again from 1834 to 1892. So he spans right across the middle of the 19th century. He also later, in the final years of his life, he wrote something known, talked about the downgrade controversy. He actually wrote on this particular thing. And what he was encountering there is the latter part of the 19th century is the rise of liberalism. We're going to talk about that in some other areas when we go through that, particularly as we're looking at the evolution of Catholic thought in the 19th century under pressure from this. But the 19th century, that same thing that's causing all that revolution and growth and enlightenment is the rise of liberalism. Now, we have to be careful here about using that word because that word is used in a lot of different contexts globally, over time and over space. When we talk today, and you hear that word liberal in the United States context, you almost probably immediately think of it in terms of a political distinction. And you're thinking of it primarily in terms of a very, I'm going to say very modern, last 50 to 60 years distinction of what that means for in American politics. Globally, that word applies in very different ways. It might be argued, probably fairly so, that American liberalism politically has moved further left in the last 50 to 60 years than it was in the mid 50s, 60s, and 70s. Globally, it's still pretty right in the big picture of the global liberal conservative spectrum. I mean, we're talking about, in the West, social democratic nations, which are far more using the left-right distinction, which I really hate the left-right distinction, by the way, but it's what we use, more liberal. But there's even more liberal than that, and there's certainly more conservative out there. Our conservatism is also to the left of where the global spectrum. We're in the middle of the big spectrum is sort of the point. And 50 years ago, the differences between our left and our right were so close to each other that people globally sort of laughed and said, "What are y'all fighting over? You're basically all in the middle here." That's changed over time. But there was this rise of modernism and liberalism that was coming in, and it was coming in and challenging Christianity as well. Probably the biggest part of this in the late 19th century is what's going on with Christian scholarship. You have the rise of some of the German modern criticism, documentary hypothesis criticism. We'll spend some time talking about this because we need to talk about this because it informs and influences our understanding of the Bible today. But late in his life, Spurgeon became very concerned that biblical Christianity was being undermined, and we'll look at why he felt that way. And he had this idea of the downgrade, which was that once you start heading down that slippery slope, you go all the way down that slippery slope. And so he actually late in his life was a strong, outspoken person and advocate for believing that there was this concept of once you compromise to a certain point, there's no return. You're going to pass this. You're going to pass this point of no return. And we're going to see how this plays into some degree into Baptist history and some of the distinctives that are different between Southern Baptists and Northern Baptists, and how that plays out as we draw to the latter part of the century. So just want you to be aware he's primarily known outside of Baptist circles for his preaching, because we looked at before, but particularly late in life, he's sort of known for this, what's called the downgrade controversy that became something that became very outspoken about. Looks very different in this picture here than it did in the other one, doesn't it?
Because eventually he was forced to resign from the Baptist
Union. And we're talking about what the Baptist Union is, because this became enough of a theological difference between Southern Baptists and American Baptists and Northern Baptists that this was a point of contention between the two.
So what year did he write that?
That was in,
Was it towards his?
it was the last 4 years of his life. So the
Okay.
dates of his life were, yeah, I was
Yeah.
gonna say 1880. So I had it in my head right.
1890.
So mid 1880s on to 1892.
The local Baptist Association is called the Union
Baptist.
Baptist Association. Does that tie back to?
The Union,
This
the Union
union?
Baptist Association existed
Organization
actually
before
before, yeah, it existed before. Again, these associations that were very local for the most part. They grew, the associations associated with each other is a good way to think about it.
Yeah.
That's how they did this. And that's still the case of how Baptist polity is organized today. We have a local association, the Union Baptist Association, which is very regional. We have a Texas, well, we actually have several conventions for the state of Texas, but there's the Baptist General Convention of Texas. There's the Southern Baptist Convention, of course, with the breaks and the splits that happened in the last 25 years. You have the Cooperative Baptist Fellowship, and you have the Southern Baptists that broke off in Texas. But the Union Baptist Association goes back, I want to say 1845-ish,
Yeah.
about the time of Texas leaving its status as a republic and becoming part of the United
It was
States.
the first association in Texas, but there are others. I think there may be a Texas Association or maybe just a Central Texas. But I've always been intrigued by the name, the Union Baptist Association. And when I saw that about Spurgeon, so that there was a Baptist Union.
There was more national.
Okay.
Yeah, more national. Theological controversy started to rise in the 1800s. It's interesting because Baptists were a growing part of Protestants when we talk about the Manifest Destiny, the Westward Expansion. They also are, and still this is true to this day, are the number one targets for a lot of break off theological groups that are on the edge of Christianity and move beyond that. So Unitarians, the Baptists were a big target for Unitarians in terms of being folks. Baptists are very independent traditionally. And so this idea of being independent of the theology made them targets for various things that would come along. So the Unitarian movement, the Universalist movement, which are similar but different, but also, and this is true down to this day, Mormonism and even Campbellism. We'll come back and talk about this a little bit. The number one Christian denomination for conversions from that denomination over to LDS or Mormonism are Baptists. That remains the same, and that is true today.
What's that?
More Baptists become Mormon than any other
Really?
denomination in terms of those that leave and join.
I don't think I knew that Mormons believed Jesus was Satan's brother.
Oh,
You didn't know that? I don't think so.
oh, I've got some stuff. I've got some stuff you'll enjoy there. Understanding who,
Now that we're on Mormonism, there is an incredibly good history book on Mormonism. Gods of many nations, or something of that nature. Goes all the way back to the very beginning. It goes into the history of how it started and facts and figures, publications, et cetera, et cetera. It's fascinating, fascinating.
there's, I'm trying to remember the name of the documentary now.
Nation of many gods, I think.
That would be a good title for something that's about
Yes, yes.
Mormonism, because of the belief that each of us has the capability to become a god.
Right.
I can't think of the name of the documentary, which was first time I saw this, first time I was exposed to this. PBS, it must have been an American Experience and not a Frontline, did an excellent two-part documentary about 10 years ago on the history of the Mormon Church, and Mormon Church is American.
Yeah.
But the history of the Mormon Church that I think was pretty fair and balanced. We watched something. What was that thing we watched on Netflix sometime in the last year? Kathy, talking about Murder Among the Mormons.
Is that pretty good?
I don't know if it's good. It's a little bit scary because this was the case of a lot of the faked antiquity type stuff. There's relics and things that would help prove Joseph Smith and Mormonism are a big part of that. And so it's called Murder Among the Mormons, or Murder Among the Mormons. And it's the case of a murder that happened in Salt Lake that is tied back to some things not getting. It's an interesting little story, and that's based in reality. But Joseph Smith early on was sort of indirectly connected to Baptists there, and talking about the burned over district. That's where Mormonism comes from. That's where Joseph Smith was, and so this I just kept this in here instead of taking it out because the realization that Baptists have interacted with a lot of these movements that have happened in the last 2 centuries, and among those is Mormonism. It's going to drive me nuts that I can't think of the name of that documentary, but I'll have to look it up before I leave. But if you don't know stuff there, Donna, there's.
Well, I have Kingdom of the Cults book, but it's so exhaustive. To take time to read it is time consuming. Watching something.
And the story even of Mormons and how they play a role in that westward expansion in the United States is interesting because yes, they end up in Utah. That's only after they've been driven out of Illinois, where they had first tried to create a place called Nauvoo. Was where the first place that was, and then they get pushed on to Utah, and then they actually. There's a massacre of. Mormon history in the United States is an interesting thing to look at, and it's. I think we did our building bridges thing and the whole thing on that. It's one of the most that and Scientology are 2 of the most interesting things for me to try to get my head around, and just trying to understand, how people could believe what they believe. I used to work for one of my bosses about 20 years ago, more than 20 years ago. That was Mormon, and so he and I had some very interesting conversations. That's when I first came to understand. That's when I started digging more into it. When I first came to understand, we were using terminology, but we weren't using terminology the same way. Because Mormons will identify and say that they are Christian, and there's and the Bible is one of their documents, but their take on that is very different.
I was
You
gonna say,
can
but
ask your
that's
boss about Jesus' wife. What would you say?
Bob and I never got into that. Most of the time when we got around this, we got around the concept of what actually happened in Eden, because the Mormons hold to a concept that it was an upward fall. Yes, there was a fall, but that it enabled the plan that Jesus had convinced God over Lucifer on how to redeem. And so it led to the redemption of that, which led to us having the ability to, if we checked all the boxes, to eventually get our own planet someday.
But actually gave more power than they would have had.
It enabled free will in a way it's considered an upward fall.
well, it says Mormons will become gods. No, Mormon men will become
That's
gods.
correct.
Mormon women will only make it to the planet if their husbands invite them.
Correct. Which is why divorce in the Mormon church is so devastating in the sense that without a husband who's going to call you forth that day, you're in a bad place. Unless we forget the magic underwear.
I heard Donnie and Marie and my husband talk about the magic underwear one time on some interview. They were trying to avoid really talking about it, but they said yes, that they were. It's supposed to be a reminder to them to keep themselves pure.
For those of you that are modern science fiction fans, both iterations of Battlestar Galactica, the 1980s version and the sci-fi reboot, contain lots of Mormon references inside of them. So Glenn Larson, who was the producer there, happened to have been a convert to Mormonism. So he injected a lot of things. And if you know what you're looking for, you'll pick up all kinds of Mormon stuff inside of that.
Just a long time ago, when I was engaged in the Mormons in my house, one of the things they pointed out was the African American community. You talk about racism, they had it.
Yeah, they didn't even believe that blacks could go to heaven. They couldn't get their own planet. They couldn't.
I think they're,
So what
Well-
magical happened in 1978?
Did they find a document, Doc?
They may have
Another
found a document, or
They
the,
found
or the other thing is the leaders, the president of the church, and the elders. You know, remember understanding that it's modern day. They also believe in an ongoing revelation.
That's right.
There-
They're
there
progressive.
must be some Mormons that still believe that, because I've counseled a girl whose grandmother is Mormon, and she thinks because this girl, she's not black, she's actually Hispanic, but she has dark skin, and she thinks that she's evil because she has dark skin. So sad.
Well, I mean, I'm not recommending it, but the Book of Mormon, the show, we went to it because we had watched something or something like that. I mean, it's a terrible, it's vulgar, and
Yeah.
you know, the people who did it are like the makers of Beavis and Butthead or something like that. But South Park, yeah. Anyway, it was interesting because it talks about Mormons who were like going to the area where it was to Africa. So I mean,
On mission, as you know.
they were going on mission. That's required of their
Right.
belief, and then they go to like a place where it's all blacks, and you know, it was a very crude thing, but if you know some of what they believe, it talked about how that's exactly what they believed about people from Africa. And I was just like, oh my gosh.
Yeah.
I mean, they're a dangerous place to tread in the Protestant South too. But there are elements of what Joseph Smith incorporated into some of their rituals that are directly lifted, from example, from Freemasonry. He directly lifted some of the ritual things directly out of that. And for those that are Masons and know those things, I'm not, but you would go, yeah, he was basically borrowed and stole that. And it's, I don't want to spend as much time here, but it's an interesting thing, and I will look up the documentary that's found in the notes right now, because I've got to get that answer in my head. It's going to trouble me all day. So in 1814, this was the first national big meeting among Baptists called the Triennial Convention in 1814. At this point, Baptist work was headquartered in Philadelphia. And so they gathered together for a convention. You might guess the triennial suggests how often they would meet, every 3 years. And so this is how Baptists were beginning to unite in 1814. Now, it doesn't take long before there's going to be a split in this convention. And we're going to sort of walk through here briefly what that is and cover at least that today. And most of that splits for two reasons. Slavery and the Civil War is going to be part of that. And then the other part is going to be a different focus on where missions should be focused. But the first Baptist meetings collectively, these associations that were going up to the level of like a national convention of Baptists, are in 1814. And most of it was headquartered there in Pennsylvania, although again, it's very dispersed in what it is. And it was around missionary work. So we're going to see that that's an important part of Baptists all the way through. The rise of sectionalism in the 1830s and 1840s, the growing thing that's on the American political scene is that westward expansion. And so there's territories that are now looking to become states. And because of the issue of slavery, you have states that are favorable towards slavery, where slavery is practiced. You have states where it's not. is that the balance of power in the American political system is very delicate at this point. And so you get compromises like the Compromise of 1820, the Compromise of 1850, which are over the admission of states. And they're over making sure that there maintains a balance, because remember the way the American political system is structured. Yes, you get your representation in the House of Representatives by population, but every state gets 2 senators and equal representation. And so keeping a balance between the number of slave states and free states is important for the balance that exists in the Senate, regardless of what the population is. And so there are more and more movements that are happening in the North towards abolition, as we move from like the 1820s through the 1840s, 50s, and of course to the 1860s. And as a result, there's a controversy that starts to arise inside of the associated work among Baptists between those in the North that are abolitionists and those in the South that are economically engaged, or in some cases directly engaged in slavery. And so this tends to be the thing that divides Baptists, among other things. We'll see missions divide them a little bit later, but this is a rising thing among American Baptists from 1800 to 1845. Why is 1845 such an important date? Well, the reason is, again, talked about this before, the issue of slavery is rising. The thing that changes economics in the early part of the 19th century around particularly cotton, which was the #1 crop. Sugar was also an important crop where slaves were involved. That tended to be a little bit more in the Caribbean than in the American South. The American South, it was cotton. There was tremendous demand for this product globally. Textile mills were coming along, so the ability to process and produce garments, you needed the raw material. The raw material was natural fibers and cotton. Cotton is not an easy thing to cultivate and harvest. It's you ever seen the movie Places in the Heart? It's a very tough thing to do.
Sugar's even worse.
Yeah. My father and his brothers and sisters picked cotton when they were kids. And so I've heard the stories of that. And the other thing was, even once you had it picked, and picking it was not easy, then you had to get the seeds and you had to separate it. Well, Eli Whitney comes along and quote unquote invents, he's not really the inventor of the cotton gin, but he popularizes it and gets the patent for it, which allows the separation of the seed and the flax from the cotton. And so cotton booms as a result of this. And so the need for the labor to support that booms and the economics of that. So there were many that just looked at slavery as being an economic system before 1830. But as the 19th century moves on, it becomes more and more of a moral issue, particularly for the abolitionists in the North, which were many Baptists that were abolitionists. Methodists were a big part of that as well. We began to look at this as being something that needed to be addressed. Forget the economics. People should not own people or should not have the ability to restrict their movement. And so, again, this was the backdrop of the 19th century in America. If you want to know one of the little dirty secrets of the American Constitutional Convention, it got brought up there and they kicked the can down the road. They intentionally realized they could not come to an agreement on this issue. And so they chose to not come to an agreement. The 3/5 compromise is an example of what comes out of that. Is how do you count? The Southern states wanted to count their slaves as citizens for the purpose of representation. And the North said, no, you can't have it both ways. So that's how you have a slave in the South for the purposes of political representation being counted as 3/5 of a person. That was purely a compromise. You're either a person or you're not a person. Philosophically, there should be no question about that. You're not 3/5 of a person. But this was the backdrop of American politics for most of the early part of the 19th century.
But back then, the Southern aristocracy was controlling everything. They had the money, they had the legislatures, and they had the wealth to proceed with whatever line of thinking that they wanted to pursue.
They were in control because of the economics, but also the economics and the politics play closely together.
You Because you had, what, 1 in 10 back then had a slave or
That's correct.
something like that?
It is a fair thing to say, Mickey, that if you want to think of all Southern rezoning slaves, you have a very misconstrued understanding of what it was. It was a theoretical, the 1%, so to speak. It was the highest echelons of the economic part of society that had that. In fact, in many cases, you had poor white, essentially sharecroppers before blacks became sharecroppers,
yeah.
who were in the same situation.
Yeah, they were slaves.
They were economically slaves. They had
That's right.
freedom. They had freedoms that blacks did not have from a political sense, but they didn't have freedoms in the sense of an economic freedom.
I owe
That's
my
what they're-
soul to the company store.
That was. This is the backdrop. This is why we ultimately have to fight a war over this.
That wasn't sharecropping, though. That was something else.
Yeah.
That same-
But
same
that
concept.
that also existed in the industrial elements
Yeah. Oh,
there,
yeah.
with coal
Oh, yeah.
mining, with manufacturing, et cetera, exactly.
So my concept of you have to have some skin in the game to be able to vote. You have to own land would not go over well because of the history that we went through in the Civil War, because the upper class had property and consequently they were the ruling class.
They were the ruling class because they had the money, but
Right.
most slaveholders did not own more than 10 slaves. Most slaveholders owned 1 or 2 or 3, and the slaves actually had a similar existence to them. They worked small farms and lived about the same way as the master. Like the 1% of the slaveholders that owned 2 or 3, 400 slaves and multiple plantations, was a very small percentage of the population.
But they
They
were,
did have-
but they were
they
the,
did have
but they were the
political
they were the
Yeah.
influential
Right.
parts.
That permeated our system where we looked down upon anyone who was a slave, or some of my ancestors were Cherokee Indians. And they were worse as far as a social group, less than the African Americans.
So in 1841, this all starts coming to a head when Richard Fuller this is at one of the meetings, recommended directly that they take an official stance of neutrality. They weren't going to come to agreement over this. Neither side was going to prevail, so let's just be neutral on the point. This did not sit well with abolitionists that were part of Baptist movement. And so in 1844, they sent basically a test case to the Home Mission Society. And these were associations that were organized around missions, recommending a slave holder for appointment as a missionary. And they specifically asked, in the case of Alabama, he was in Georgia, but Alabama asked, would they appoint a slave-holder to a position of leadership inside the association, trying to resolve this issue. And the resounding result back was, no, we're not going to be neutral on this, and no, we can't come to an agreement on this. And so in 1845, Baptists that were in the South met in Georgia, Atlanta, Augusta, actually, particularly just outside of Atlanta, and they formed the Southern Baptist Convention. So they were you could call them a breakaway convention, in the sense that they were breaking away from what had been the triennial convention and the associated work that was there. But again, remembering all of this was through association. This was not hierarchical to begin with. So the fact that they chose to organize separately, yes, they were breaking away from what had been, but not in the sense of that what had been was an organized top-down denomination. But the Southern Baptist Convention did form over 2 issues. One of them being slavery, and the question of slavery inside a Baptist association, or the second one being really proximity. Because here you have Southern Baptists that to go to Philadelphia or someplace in the mid-Atlantic or in the north to go to these meetings, that was quite an endeavor with travel back during that period of time. This is before the big rise of railroads. I mean, it was quite a thing to go. And so this idea of that we would be better served by having a more local, regional, sectional convention was the other aspect. Don't lose the slavery part. It's real, it's there, but that was not the only driving force. But those aligned rather nicely, because those that were in the South were going to be the ones who were probably going to be on the one side of the slavery issue, and we were closer together. So those 2 things worked together. So in 1845, the Southern Baptist Convention is formed.
Well, Foreign Mission Board or the Mission Society not want to allow the slaveholder to become?
They were put, by this point, it had become such an issue that they were intentionally raising questions about, they were asking the questions about their position on slavery as part of the process of being appointed. In the early, 1814-ish period of time, that wasn't something. By now it had become that, primarily because of what had gone on in the 1830s and 1840s.
Yeah, there's a book I've been looking at buying. I think on the debate between, it's a series of articles written and letters written between two Baptists, one in Massachusetts and one in Worcester, South Carolina, on the issue of slavery in scripture.
This is also a time period where the Indians were also being rounded up and sent on reservations and tried to subdue them.
Trail of Tears is during that
Oh,
period
yeah.
of time.
Some of my ancestors
Yeah,
made that journey.
And this is also what's being encountered with the Westward Expansion of
Right.
what's going on as well. The Plains tribes, even the Texas history that we know that's in the, after Moses and Stephen Austin come here, and then Texas breaking away. But part of the reason, for example, there was a cannon that you have to do a come and take it for. Part of the reason that cannon even existed was to protect that settlement from Indian raids.
Right.
And the reason the Indians were raiding was what was being done to them. So it worked all around.
Well, you also had the Comanches that were Plains Indian coming down and making raids and what have you. That's why we're here, because Mexican government and the Spanish government realized that they needed somebody dumb enough to come in and get their heads down.
Well, the other part there is the idea that, if you have this one idea that all the Native Americans were all friendly and got along, you have a very
Oh,
different,
they hate each other.
wrong understanding of what's there. Yeah. So the Southern Baptist
Your
Convention
ancestors-
in 1845 in May.
That's right.
Now, some things, and we'll pick this up here next week, because a lot of things come out of that have nothing to do with the issue of slavery. Things that we are very familiar with, particularly missions. And Southern Baptists, even more so than Northern Baptists, are known for being mission-minded and mission-oriented. For example, WU, Annie Armstrong and Lottie Moon, for which offerings are named, are part of what's there. Sunday school, as we know it, is and organized the way that it is out of the Sunday school board with a publishing house that leads towards that. Is all this is all out of Southern Baptist life.
But why? Why are the Northern Baptists, if they were in sync except for the concept of slavery, how come the Northern Baptists, if they're just a smaller unit?
The smaller unit, we're going to see. We're not going to have time to get into that in detail today. What Northern Baptists did during and after the war also played into this as well. But a lot of Northern Baptist missionary work was to the south to help out Southern Baptists during and after the war. I have this bad tendency in my mental scope on American history. 1865, the war is over. No, 1865, the war is over. Reconstruction begins.
Right.
And Reconstruction had to happen because things had to be constructed again. Reconstruction.
Right.
Churches were lost, literally torn down in some cases for firewood. So you need to rebuild just the church infrastructure. You had an economic situation. Suddenly you had freedmen. You had freed blacks. Okay, now what? Yeah. And so there was a lot that was going on, and we're going to see the role that Northern Baptists played that was very key in that, I think, and crucial in that. We're going to see how that plays out and then how Southern Baptists respond. The way that I think of it, right or wrong, is that led to the work that Northern Baptists did, missionary work into the South, led to Southern Baptists wanting to do mission work globally. So there's actually, I think, a linear connection that you can draw out of that. We took the little Mormon detour in the middle there today, so that cost us a little time, but that's okay. I'm going to go ahead and just ask if there's any last questions. I'm about to stop the recording if I can actually find the magic place to do that.